Deep in the scorched mountains of Varkon Pass, Kestrel Unit was trapped, outgunned, and down to their last 2 magazines. Both exits sealed, helicopters grounded, radios dead, and enemy fighters tightening the circle with every passing minute. The command room at Fort Sable Ridge had gone silent. Every option was gone. What nobody saw coming was the quiet woman in the corner of the map room, the contract analyst, the one soldiers barely noticed, who stood up, pulled on her gloves, picked up a rifle case, and walked into the dark. By sunrise, 30 enemy fighters were dead. Nobody could explain how. Nobody even knew her real name. If you're new here, this channel is where stories like this live. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's get into it. Fort Sable Ridge sat at the edge of the world, or at least the edge of the kind of world most people preferred to live in. The forward operating base had been carved into the base of a ridgeline where the rock ran orange and the wind came off the mountains carrying heat instead of relief. Summer here wasn't a season, it was a punishment. The kind that cracked lips, bleached gear, and made men forget what shade felt like. Kestrel Unit had been operating out of Fort Sable Ridge for 11 weeks. Chief Nolan Breck ran the team the way he ran everything. Clean, direct, no wasted motion. His men knew their jobs. Soren Pike could crack any lock, physical or digital, in under 4 minutes. Dale Merritt had kept 3 men alive on 2 combat tours with nothing but field supplies and stubbornness. And Wes Harlan, the youngest on the team by 4 years, was fast, instinctive, and almost impossible to rattle. Almost. His one consistent flaw was the same thing that made him useful. He moved before he thought. In the field, that kind of instinct could save a life, or end one. No one had been trying to slow him down for months. Commander Adrian Vale ran the operation from the command room. He was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. Vale had been running forward operations long enough to understand that discipline wasn't about volume, it was about structure. He trusted process the way other men trusted luck. But he wasn't cold. He knew every operator under his command by name, knew how long they'd been away from home, knew which ones had kids. That wasn't sentiment. That was accountability. Keeping people alive required knowing exactly who could afford to take risks and who couldn't. For Vale, process wasn't a preference. It was the only framework he trusted to bring people home. That distinction would matter later. Sergeant Mira Dane managed battlefield communications from a workstation near the back wall, her eyes fixed on signal feeds that flickered more than they held steady in the canyon interference. Mira had a habit that nobody commented on. She kept a secondary audio log running alongside the official system, a personal record she had started after a miscommunication. 2 deployments ago had cost a man his leg. She had logged every significant conversation in the command room since. Nobody knew. Nobody asked. And then there was Rhea Lockhart. She worked in the corner of the map room, surrounded by terrain overlays, satellite imagery, and topographical printouts pinned 3 layers deep. Small frame-worn field jacket the color of pale sand, hair pulled back low. She didn't socialize. She didn't insert herself into tactical discussions. She listened, noted, and returned to her maps. Some of the junior soldiers called her the line drawer behind her back. She never acknowledged. What they didn't notice was the callus on her right thumb, not the callus of someone who held pens, but of someone who had spent years holding a trigger. What they didn't notice was Wes Harlan one evening near the perimeter fence, watching her stand completely still with her eyes closed and her head tilted slightly into the wind, as if she were measuring something no one else could feel. He thought she was strange. He walked away without asking. He would think about that moment again later, in a very different light. And what no one noticed at all was the thin file locked inside her personal storage case, its header mostly blacked out, only 2 words still legible at the bottom. Lumen Vale. The mission had looked clean on paper. Kestrel Unit was running a reconnaissance sweep through Varkon Pass, locate a suspected weapons cache, confirm coordinates, extract without contact. No engagement expected. 3 hours in, 3 hours out. Nolan had done harder jobs before breakfast. They were 40 minutes into the pass when the first shots came from the eastern ridgeline. Single cracks, widely spaced, the kind of fire designed to redirect movement rather than kill. Nolan recognized the pattern and didn't like it. He called the team into a tighter formation and pushed toward the center of Crescent Ravine, a narrow channel of rock that curved like a blade through the valley floor. It offered cover. It offered concealment. It offered exactly what the enemy wanted them to think it offered. By the time Kestrel Unit reached the middle of the ravine, both ends were gone. The northern exit had been blocked by a burning vehicle rolled into position from a side track. The southern end collapsed under coordinated fire from 3 elevated positions simultaneously. Within 90 seconds, every high point along the ravine walls was producing suppressing fire, and Kestrel Unit had nowhere to move that wasn't inside someone's sightline. Wes Harlan broke left toward a cluster of boulders before Nolan finished the order to hold. He made it barely, but the movement drew a burst of fire that forced Dale Merritt into the open for 3 seconds too long. A round caught Dale in the left shoulder. He went down hard, rolled behind a rock shelf, and came back up, pressing his own sleeve against the wound with the focused calm of a man who had been shot before. Wes saw it happen. He saw exactly which 3 seconds had done it, and he knew whose decision those 3 seconds belonged to. Nolan pulled the team into the lowest point of the ravine and got on the radio. The signal reached Fort Sable Ridge in fragments. Mira Dane pieced it together from broken transmissions. 2 magazines remaining, 1 man down, both exits sealed. Enemy reinforcements moving in from the east. She relayed it to Commander Vale in flat, precise language, the way she delivered every report, regardless of what it meant. Then, she quietly opened her secondary audio log. Vale moved immediately. He requested air support. The duty officer confirmed what the weather feed already showed: canyon wind shear at the ravine entrance was beyond helicopter operating limits. Vale requested armored vehicle access. The route assessment came back negative. The road into the ravine was less than 4 meters wide at its narrowest point, and the burning vehicle at the northern exit had made it impassable. He considered artillery support and ruled it out in the same breath. Kestrel Unit's position was too close to the enemy line. The margin for error didn't exist. The command room got quiet. Rhea hadn't moved from her map table. She had been studying the terrain overlay for Varkon Pass since the first transmission came in, tracing contour lines with her finger in slow, deliberate passes. When the room went silent, she spoke. She identified a narrow climbing route on the western face, unmarked, less than a meter wide in places, running up to a rock formation called Glass Needle, the highest unobstructed point above Crescent Ravine, a position from which the entire ravine floor was visible. Vale looked at the route. Then he looked at her. "That's not a path for civilians," he said. Rhea didn't argue. She didn't present credentials or make a case for herself. She just looked at the radio console where Mira was still trying to hold the signal and asked one question. "If no one goes up there, how many minutes do they have left?" The room didn't answer. The radio answered instead. Nolan Breck's voice clipped and flat. "We're down to 1.5. Make a decision." Vale's decision was to wait. He ordered Kestrel Unit to hold position, conserve ammunition, and maintain radio contact until wind conditions at the ravine entrance dropped enough for helicopter approach. His voice carried the same weight it always did. Measured, certain, the voice of a man who had built a career on not making emotional decisions under pressure. Rhea listened to the order. She looked at the terrain overlay one more time, running the numbers in her head the way she always did. Wind speed, elevation change, estimated enemy movement rate, remaining ammunition versus contact time. The math didn't produce a scenario where Kestrel Unit survived long enough for the weather to shift. she stepped away from the map table. No one saw her move through the back corridor to the equipment storage room. No one saw her enter the 6-digit code on her personal case, the one she had never opened in front of anyone at Fort Sable Ridge. Inside was a rifle, broken down into 3 components: a suppressor, 2 loaded magazines, and a small, handheld radio set to a frequency that didn't appear in the base's communication directory. Sergeant Mira Dane was the only one who saw her in the hallway. Rhea had the case in one hand and her field jacket zipped to the collar. She wasn't moving fast. She wasn't moving the way people move when they're afraid or desperate. She was moving the way people move when they have already made a decision and the only thing left is execution. Mira stepped into her path. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mira looked at the case. She looked at Rhea's face, at the absence of hesitation there, the absence of doubt, something underneath the surface that Mira had spent 11 weeks catching only in fragments and never understanding until now. This wasn't a contract analyst who had snapped under pressure. This was someone who had been waiting very patiently for the moment when there was no other option. Mira didn't ask questions. She walked to the side exit, a secondary gate used for equipment transfers, monitored by a camera with a documented 12-second rotation gap, and held it open for 20 seconds without looking back. Rhea walked through. The desert beyond the perimeter fence absorbed her almost immediately. Dark jacket against dark rock, moving without a flashlight, following a line through the terrain that she had traced so many times on paper that her feet found it without instruction. She moved along the base of the western ridgeline, staying below the skyline, choosing the sharp-edged gullies that would shred the boots of anyone who hadn't specifically prepared for them. Back in the command room, Vale noticed the map table was empty 4 minutes later. He asked Mira where Lockhart had gone. Mira told him she had stepped out. Vale's jaw tightened. "Get her back," he said. "I can't reach her," Mira said. "Her radio isn't on our frequency." Vale stared at the terrain map, at the thin, unmarked line running up the western face toward Glass Needle, at the position Rhea had pointed to 30 minutes ago, the one he had dismissed as impossible for a civilian. He didn't say anything else. He pulled up a chair, sat down directly in front of the main radio console, and waited. Not for the helicopters, not for the weather report, for whatever came next. The western face of Varkon Pass was not a climbing route. It was a collection of problems: loose shale shelves, vertical crack systems barely wide enough for a boot edge, exposed traverses where the wind came off the ridge in sudden hard gusts that had nothing to do with the canyon conditions below. In daylight, with proper gear, it would have been a serious technical climb. In the dark, in full field kit, carrying a rifle case strapped across her back, it was something most people wouldn't have attempted at all. Rhea moved through it like she had been here before. Not quickly wasn't the point. Every placement was deliberate. She tested each hold before committing weight, read the rock face with her fingertips in the dark, and paused at every exposed section long enough to scan the ground below for patrol movement. Twice, she froze completely, pressing flat against the rock, while an enemy patrol passed along the valley floor 30 meters beneath her, close enough that she could hear the crunch of boots on gravel. She didn't move again until they were gone. Below her, Crescent Ravine was deteriorating. Nolan Breck had reorganized what was left of their defensive position into the lowest depression in the ravine floor, a natural bowl in the rock that offered maybe 60 centimeters of cover from the elevated firing positions. It wasn't enough. Every time the team shifted, the high points responded. Someone up there had good optics and the patience to use them. Dale Merritt had gotten his shoulder wrapped using his own kit, working one-handed with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the procedure. He was functional, but his left arm had limited range, and he knew it. He told Nolan he was fine. Nolan didn't argue, because arguing wouldn't change the shoulder. Soren Pike was pressed against the ravine wall, with his jaw set, and his breathing too controlled the stillness of a man managing the edge of panic by sheer discipline. Wes Harlan sat behind a boulder with his rifle across his knees and said nothing at all. He was watching Dale move with one working arm, carefully, deliberately compensating for damage that had happened in a 3-second window that Wes had opened. He didn't look away from it. He didn't try to rationalize it. He just sat with the full weight of what his decision had cost someone else, which was the hardest and most necessary thing he had done in 11 weeks. Nolan checked the ammunition count for the 3rd time, as if the number might have changed. It hadn't. Then the radio clicked. A voice came through, low, unhurried female, on a frequency none of them recognized. "Kestrel, this is North Star. Don't ask who I am. When I say move, you move. Direction and distance, nothing else. Confirm." Nolan looked at the radio. He looked at Soren, who shrugged with his eyes. He looked at Dale, who nodded once, the nod of a man who had no remaining preference for skepticism. Nolan pressed the transmit button. "North Star Kestrel confirms. Standing by." 30 seconds of silence. Then, from somewhere high above the ravine's western wall, so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the wind moving through the rock, a single, sharp sound. Not an echo. Not settling stone. A shot. On the northern ridgeline, the highest elevated position, went silent. Nolan Breck looked up at the dark western face of Varkon Pass and understood with complete and sudden clarity that whoever North Star was, she had been up there for a while, watching, measuring, waiting for exactly the right moment. And she was just getting started. Rhea worked from the top down. That was the first principle: remove command, collapse structure, force the enemy into individual decision-making. A unit without a commander wasn't a unit. It was a collection of armed men who no longer knew what the plan was. The command element was positioned on the northeastern shelf. 3 men, one of whom had been issuing hand signals to the other firing positions every 90 seconds, with the regularity of someone who had done this many times before. Rhea had been watching him for 4 minutes before she reached Glass Needle. She had his timing, his position, and the wind correction for the distance before she finished setting up. The first shot ended the hand signals. She was already moving to her secondary position before the echo left the canyon. The second principle was speed of transition. Never fire twice from the same point. Glass Needle wasn't a single outcropping, but a series of connected ledges running along the upper western face, and Rhea had studied its geometry from satellite imagery long enough to know exactly which ledge connected to which, how far each transition required her to move, and how long each move would take. She had planned this without knowing she would ever need it. That was habit. That was what 11 weeks of reading the same terrain over and over produced. The radio clicked in her earpiece. "North Star, we have movement on the southern end. They're pushing 2 men forward." "I see them," she said. "Hold." The 2 men advancing along the southern wall were using the ravine's shadow line as cover, a reasonable tactic that assumed no one had a line of sight from the western elevation. Rhea waited until they cleared the shadow and crossed into the open ground between 2 rock formations. 4 seconds of exposure. She needed 2. "Kestrel, move north, 15 meters, now." The team moved. Rhea fired. The southern advance stopped. Below her, she could see the enemy formation beginning to fragment. The loss of their command element had done exactly what it was supposed to do. The remaining fighters were no longer operating as a coordinated unit. Some were pulling back to previous positions, some were holding. 2 were moving laterally along the ravine wall, apparently trying to locate the source of fire. They were looking east. The shot angles they were analyzing pointed east. No one was looking west and up. That was the third principle. Make the geometry of your shots point somewhere you aren't. North Star, the eastern approach. We're getting radio chatter. Sounds like reinforcements. Nolan's voice. Steady, which told Rhea the team was holding together. "How far out?" she asked. 10 minutes, maybe less. She recalculated. 10 minutes was workable. The remaining active firing positions were 3-1 on the northern wall, 2 on the elevated platform above the ravine's midpoint. The northern position was partially sheltered, which meant she needed a specific angle that only one of her remaining ledges could provide. She moved to it, set up, controlled her breathing, and waited for the wind to settle into its 3-second lull pattern she had identified 20 minutes ago. The northern position went quiet on the next lull. 8 minutes. The two midpoint positions were the problem. They were close enough together that taking one would cause the other to immediately relocate, and relocation meant losing the target. She needed both in the same window. She watched them. Watched their communication pattern, the way they angled toward each other when they exchanged signals. There was a moment every 2 minutes when both men oriented toward the ravine floor simultaneously. She waited for it. When it came, she used it. Kestrel, southern exit is open. Move now. Stay left, follow the wall, don't stop. She watched from Glass Needle as Kestrel Unit broke from the rock depression and moved Nolan first, reading the ground. Soren behind him, Dale running with his left arm pinned against his side, and Wes Harlan last, covering the rear without being told to. They moved well. They moved like men, who trusted the voice in their earpiece completely, which Rhea reflected was something she had not expected to feel anything about. She felt something about it anyway. By the time Kestrel Unit cleared the southern exit, 30 enemy fighters were no longer a problem. Nolan stopped at the ravine mouth and looked back up at the western face. High on the rock, barely visible against the dark stone, a small figure was breaking down a rifle with quick, practiced movements. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then, he got his team moving toward Fort Sable Ridge. Fort Sable Ridge received Kestrel Unit at 0340 hours. Dale Merritt went directly to the medical station. The shoulder wound was clean. The round had passed through without hitting bone, which Dale had apparently known since it happened and chosen not to mention. Wes Harlan sat outside the medical station on an equipment crate and didn't move for a long time. He wasn't injured. He was doing the accounting that soldiers do after operations where their decisions had consequences for other people. Rhea came through the perimeter gate 20 minutes after the team. Alone on foot, rifle case strapped across her back, sand in her hair, and a shallow cut along her left forearm from the descent. She walked through the base without stopping until she reached the map room, set the case down against the wall, and sat in her chair. Commander Vale was waiting for her. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his way. But the silence he held for the first 10 seconds of that conversation communicated everything his tone withheld. He cited the unauthorized departure, the breach of operational protocol, the use of unregistered communications frequency, the engagement without orders, and the security implications of a contracted civilian entering an active combat zone without clearance. Rhea let him finish. Then she said, "I didn't break protocol to prove a point. I broke it because they were going to die." Vale looked at her for a long moment. There was something working behind his eyes. Not anger exactly, more like a man who had constructed a very precise argument and was now watching it struggle against a fact it hadn't accounted for. Nolan Breck walked in before Vale could respond. He didn't ask permission to speak. He told Vale directly, without decoration, without hedging, that Kestrel Unit was alive because of Rhea Lockhart, and that he wanted that on record. He said it the way men say things they have already decided they will not be talked out of. Vale said nothing. Wes Harlan had followed Nolan in and stood near the doorway. He looked at Rhea, at her hands at the rifle case against the wall, and his expression held something that hadn't been there before. He had stood at the perimeter fence months ago and watched her measure the wind and walked away without understanding what he was seeing. He had moved before thinking in Crescent Ravine, and Dale had paid for it. Now he stood in a doorway, looking at the woman who had undone the consequences of his mistake, and he understood precisely and without comfort that seeing something and understanding it were not the same thing. The debrief ended without resolution. Vale dismissed the room but kept his eyes on Rhea's file long after everyone else had left. What the base security system had flagged during the operation was already sitting in his inbox, a report generated automatically when an unregistered communications protocol was used inside the perimeter. The flag had pulled Rhea's contractor profile, cross-referenced her communication signature against existing databases, and returned a match that shouldn't have existed in a civilian contractor's background. The match pointed to a program designation that Vale recognized. Project Lumen Vale. He had heard the name once, 3 years ago, in a briefing he hadn't been cleared to attend in full. A black-budget training program. Operators developed outside conventional military structure, no service records, no official designations, no paperwork that connected them to anything. The program had officially been dissolved. Its participants had been dispersed into cover identities. One of them apparently had been drawing terrain maps at Fort Sable Ridge for 11 weeks. By morning, a man named Silas Trent had been dispatched from an office whose name didn't appear on standard organizational charts. He arrived at Fort Sable Ridge before noon, quiet, unhurried, carrying a single bag, and the stillness that belongs to people whose job is to make problems disappear before they become visible. He wasn't there to commend Rhea Lockhart. He was there because a ghost had started casting a shadow. And that was the kind of problem his office existed to correct. Silas Trent took 48 hours to build his case before he moved. He was methodical in the way that people are methodical when they have done this before, reviewing communication logs, cross-referencing Rhea's movements against base security footage, pulling her contractor file, and reading the gaps in it as carefully as the content. He didn't interview her directly. He interviewed everyone around her first. 2 junior soldiers who worked adjacent to the map room, the duty officer who had been on shift when Rhea left, and Mira Dane, who answered every question precisely, completely, and in a way that gave Trent exactly what he asked for, and nothing he hadn't. Rhea watched him work without appearing to watch. She returned to her maps, her satellite imagery, her terrain overlays. She ate in the mess hall at the same time she always did. She gave Trent nothing to read in her behavior because her behavior didn't change. But she was counting down. On the second evening, Nolan found her at the perimeter fence, the same spot where Wes had seen her months ago. He stood beside her without speaking for a while. The mountains ran dark orange in the last light, indifferent to everything happening at their feet. Nolan set something on the fence post between them. A challenge coin, brass, worn smooth on one face from handling. The Kestrel Unit insignia on the reverse. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. Rhea looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up and closed her hand around it. And Nolan understood from the way she did it that no one had given her something like that in a long time. "I was going to leave," she said. "I know," he said. "It's cleaner. For everyone." "Cleaner isn't the same as better," Nolan said. He looked out at the ridgeline. "We don't want clean. We want you." She didn't answer. But she didn't leave that night. The following morning, Trent made his move. He presented Vale with a formal security assessment designating Rhea Lockhart as an uncleared risk. Her use of Lumen Vale protocols, her unauthorized combat engagement, her unregistered communications equipment. He requested immediate restriction of her base access and authorization to transfer her to a secure facility for full debriefing. Vale read the assessment. He approved the access restriction. Rhea's keycard stopped working at 0900. By 0930, new intelligence had come in through a local Allied network, a distress signal originating from Red Salt Depot, a decommissioned storage facility 18 kilometers east, deep inside contested territory. The signal was relayed through a liaison named Garrett, a local contact who had been providing Kestrel Unit with ground-level route intelligence for the past 2 months. It was Garrett's information that had identified the alternative extraction path out of Crescent Ravine. Now Garrett himself was among those trapped, along with 2 military personnel and a group of local allies. Vale brought it to Trent. Trent's response was immediate. The situation at Red Salt Depot was a matter for conventional response channels. Rhea Lockhart was a security priority. One did not supersede the other. Vale looked at the intelligence report. He looked at Trent. He thought about Garrett, who had handed Kestrel Unit a lifeline because he had decided to trust them. He approved Trent's restriction order. But something in Vale's expression had shifted the look of a man whose framework for a situation has just developed a crack he can't argue away. Process had always been his answer. Process had brought people home. But process had also just looked him in the eye and told him to leave Garrett in enemy territory. And Vale was finding, for the first time in a long career, that he couldn't make the numbers come out the same way they always had. That evening, Nolan came to Rhea's quarters. She was sitting on her bunk with the challenge coin on the table in front of her and the Lumen Vale file open in her hands. The real one, not the redacted version in the base system. The one she had been carrying for 4 years. Nolan told her about Red Salt Depot, about Garrett. Rhea closed the file. "How long do they have?" she asked. "Trent says it's not our problem," Nolan said. "That's not what I asked." Trent moved on Rhea at 0600 the following morning. 2 security personnel arrived at her quarters with a transfer order formal signed, bearing the kind of authorization code that didn't invite discussion. Rhea read it without expression. She set it on the table next to the challenge coin and asked for 30 minutes to gather her belongings. The request was granted. She didn't use the 30 minutes to pack. Nolan Breck was in Vale's office before 0615. The conversation was not quiet. For the first time since Kestrel Unit had arrived at Fort Sable Ridge, Nolan Breck raised his voice at a superior officer. Not from anger exactly, but from the intensity of a man who has identified a specific wrong and has decided the professional cost of saying so clearly is worth paying. He laid out the situation at Red Salt Depot. He named Garrett. He told Vale that the man who had saved Kestrel Unit's lives in Crescent Ravine was currently trapped in enemy territory, and that the only asset on this base with the capability to do anything about it was being packaged for transfer because a bureaucrat from an unnamed office had decided she was more useful as a file than as a person. Vale listened to all of it without interrupting. When no one finished, Vale said, "My hands are tied, Breck." "No, sir," Nolan said. "They're not. You're choosing not to use them." Vale looked at him for a long moment. He thought about every decision he had made in the past 72 hours, the helicopter request, the artillery assessment, the restriction order, the approval he had given Trent, while something behind his eyes was already telling him the numbers weren't adding up. He had built his career on a principle that structure protected people, and it did. Until the moment it didn't. This was that moment. He didn't say anything to Nolan. He stood up, walked to the door and held it open. Rhea was in the corridor outside the map room when Soren Pike fell into step beside her. Then Dale Merritt, left arm in a partial sling, moving with the careful economy of someone managing pain without advertising it. Then Wes Harlan, who positioned himself directly in front of her and stopped walking. She stopped. Wes wasn't the kind of person who prepared speeches. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has spent considerable time arriving at something simple. "I saw you at the fence," he said, "months ago. You were reading the wind. I walked away because I didn't understand what I was looking at." He paused. "I'm not walking away this time." Rhea looked at the 3 of them. Soren with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Dale already doing the math on whether his shoulder would hold for an 18-kilometer insert. Wes standing in her path with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned something expensive and intended to use it. She had spent 4 years building a life that didn't require anyone to stand in front of her. 4 years making sure that the people around her couldn't be used against her, couldn't be hurt because of her, couldn't be pulled into the wreckage that followed her real history wherever it went. The logic was clean. The logic had always been clean. The logic was also, she was beginning to understand a way of avoiding something that had nothing to do with tactics. "If you come with me," she said, "Trent will use it. All of you." "Let him," Soren said. She looked at Dale. "Don't look at me," Dale said. "I've been shot. I'm already having a bad week." Something moved across Ria's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. At 07:20, Commander Adrian Vale walked into the base security monitoring station and personally logged a scheduled maintenance window for the Eastern Perimeter camera system. A 40-minute gap, fully documented, entirely procedural. He handed the log to the duty officer without comment and walked back to his office. The Eastern Perimeter gate was unmanned for the duration of the maintenance window. Nolan Breck was waiting there with full kit when Ria came through the corridor with the rifle case across her back. Soren, Dale, and Wes fell in behind her without a word. Ria stopped at the gate and looked back once, not at the base, not at Trent's temporary office, but at the map room window where the terrain overlays for Red Salt Depot were still pinned to the board. She had memorized them 3 days ago. She pushed the gate open and walked into the pre-dawn dark. And this time, she wasn't alone. Red Salt Depot was a decommissioned storage facility built into the base of a sandstone escarpment. 3 low buildings connected by covered walkways, surrounded by a perimeter wall that had been solid once and was now compromised in 4 places Rhea had identified from satellite imagery. The enemy presence was a rotating guard pattern, 8 men on active patrol, 4 positioned at fixed points covering the main approach from the west. They were not expecting anyone from the north. Rhea led the team along the base of the escarpment in single file, moving through a dry drainage channel that ran parallel to the depot's northern wall. The channel was too shallow for standing cover, but deep enough to break their silhouette against the ridge. She set the pace slow enough to be silent, fast enough to stay inside the window Vale's maintenance gap had given them. She called each stop with a hand signal before Nolan could issue one. He noticed. He let her lead. At the northern wall, she found the compromised section she had marked from imagery, a 2-meter gap where the original construction had used a different material that had weathered faster than the surrounding structure. She tested it with 2 fingers, and it gave without resistance. "Soren," she said quietly. Soren was already beside her, reading the gap the same way she was. He pulled 2 pieces of equipment from his kit, worked for 90 seconds, and nodded. They went through in pairs. Inside the perimeter, Rhea directed the team with the economy of someone navigating a space they had walked through in their head many times already. Left along the interior wall. Stop at the corner of the second building. Wait for the patrol rotation to open the eastern corridor. The patrol rotation opened on schedule. She sent Nolan and Wes toward the main holding area, the largest of the 3 buildings, the one with the only ground floor windows that had shown heat signatures in the imagery. She kept Soren with her to manage the 2 fixed point guards covering the interior courtyard. Dale positioned himself at the breach point with the personnel they would need to move out quickly. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not dramatic in the way that people who haven't done this work imagine it to be. It was a sequence of precise decisions executed in the correct order under time pressure. Rhea cleared the courtyard positions in a window between patrol passes. Soren managed the eastern door. Nolan and Wes found Garrett and the 2 military personnel in the main building's back room. Dehydrated one with a broken wrist from rough handling. All 3 functional enough to move. There was one unplanned moment. A guard who wasn't on the patrol rotation emerged from the western building at the wrong time and crossed into Rhea's sightline while she was mid-transition between positions. She had no shot that didn't cross Wes Harlan's extraction path. She called it on the radio and held. Wes heard it. He read the geometry of the situation from her 2-word call-out, adjusted his line by 4 meters, and handled the problem from his own angle without breaking stride. Clean. Considered. No wasted motion. Rhea registered it without comment, but she registered it. Extraction through the northern breach took 4 minutes. Dale moved the rescued personnel with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided his shoulder was not a relevant variable. Garrett recognized Nolan in the dark and gripped his arm for a moment before Dale got him moving. No one had time for anything more than that which was probably right. They were 2 kilometers from Red Salt Depot when the sky began to lighten in the east. Nobody spoke much on the return. The quiet that follows something that worked, not celebratory, not relieved exactly, just the stillness of people who have done a hard thing correctly and are still processing the fact that it came out the other side. Rhea walked at the back of the formation. At one point, Wes dropped back and fell into step beside her. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. After a few minutes, he moved back up to his position. It was enough. Silas Trent was waiting when they came through the gate. He had the transfer order in his hand and 2 security personnel behind him, and the expression of a man who had anticipated exactly this outcome and prepared accordingly. He was calm. He was certain. He had spent a career being both of those things in rooms where other people weren't, and it had served him well. Commander Vale was standing beside him. Trent presented the transfer order to Vale and requested that Rhea Lockhart be taken into custody immediately. Vale took the document. He read it. He set it on the hood of the nearest vehicle with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is no longer interested in reversing it. Then he said, "I'm assuming operational responsibility for last night's action. Full command authorization, my signature. Whatever happened at Red Salt Depot happened under my direct order." Trent stared at him. "That's not what the security log shows."
The security log shows a scheduled maintenance window,
Vale said.
properly documented, authorized by the base commander, which is me.
"You're obstructing a formal security investigation." "I'm commanding a forward operating base," Vale said. "And I'm telling you that the asset you want to transfer produced the only successful outcome this installation has generated in the past 72 hours. Twice. Once without authorization because I was too slow to give it, and once under my direct command." He paused. "Write that in your report." Mira Dane appeared from the communications building with a tablet and handed it to Trent without a word. On it was a time-stamped recording audio pulled from her personal secondary log. The one she had been running since a miscommunication 2 deployments ago had cost a man his leg. Capturing Trent's exchange with Vale the previous morning, in which Trent had explicitly confirmed awareness of the Red Salt Depot distress signal and had directed Vale to deprioritize rescue action in favor of the Rhea Lockhart transfer. Trent looked at the tablet. He looked at Mira. He looked at Vale. The certainty in his face didn't disappear, but it recalibrated. He left Fort Sable Ridge before noon. Before he got into the vehicle, he stopped in front of Rhea and looked at her with the evaluating stillness that had characterized everything he did. "The past doesn't stay buried," he said. "Not for people like you." "I know," Rhea said. She didn't look away. She didn't qualify it. She held his gaze until he got in the vehicle and the vehicle left, and then she turned back toward the base. 1 month later, Fort Sable Ridge looked more or less the same from the outside. The rock was still orange. The wind still came off the mountains carrying heat. The mountains remained entirely indifferent. Inside the command room, Rhea Lockhart's position had changed. Her workstation was no longer in the corner. It sat directly adjacent to the central tactical table. Nobody had made an announcement about it. One morning, it had simply been moved, and no one questioned it, because no one needed to. Vale had formally requested her transition from contracted analyst to special operations terrain advisor. The paperwork was moving through channels slowly, but it was moving. Nolan had given her the Kestrel Unit patch on a Tuesday afternoon, with no ceremony, just set it on her desk and said, "You've had it since Crescent Ravine anyway," and walked back out. She pinned it to the inside of her field jacket, where it sat against the fabric close to her and invisible to everyone else, which felt correct. She began spending evenings with Wes Harlan. Not socially exactly, but instructionally. Terrain reading, how to identify a kill angle from a contour line, how to calculate wind effect across elevation changes, how to look at a piece of ground and understand what it would do to you before you stepped onto it. Wes was a better student than she expected. He had the instincts, he had always had them. He just needed to learn to slow them down long enough to aim them. Dale had asked her to review the base's medical evacuation routes. She produced a revised plan in 48 hours that cut average extraction time by 30%. Dale read it, said, "Yeah, that's better," in the tone of someone who didn't give compliments often, and meant them when he did, and submitted it to Vale for implementation. Soren occasionally brought her coffee without being asked, set it on her desk and left. She never figured out how he knew when she needed it. She stopped trying. On a Thursday evening, an emergency signal came in from a patrol unit in the northern sector. 4 men, last known position, near a ridge system called Harrow's Edge. Communications lost, weather moving in fast. The terrain file for Harrow's Edge was sparse. Poor satellite coverage limited ground data. 3 prior operations that had come back with incomplete information. The command room went quiet. Everyone looked at the same place at the same time. Rhea was already looking at the map. She pulled the Harrow's Edge overlay, cross-referenced it against the weather projection, and traced a line through the ridge system with her finger. The slow, deliberate motion that everyone in that room had learned meant something between calculation and certainty. She pulled on her gloves. "Give me their last coordinates," she said. Nobody hesitated. Outside the mountains caught the first light of dawn, the way they always did, indifferent, ancient burning orange against a sky that didn't care what happened beneath it. Rhea Lockhart walked through the gate with her rifle case across her back and the Kestrel Unit patch against her chest, and the stillness of someone who has stopped running from what they are. She had spent 4 years being invisible. She had spent the last month learning that invisible and alone were not the same thing. The mountains didn't forgive mistakes, but they didn't get to decide who came back from them either. And that's the story of Rhea Lockhart, the woman nobody looked at twice, right up until the moment she changed everything. Here's what stays with me. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to be the loudest voice in the room or the name on the report. Sometimes the most capable person in the building is the one sitting quietly in the corner, doing the work, waiting for the moment it actually matters. Rhea didn't save those men to prove something. She saved them because it was the right thing to do, and she was the only one who could. That's not heroism as a performance, that's just character. If this story hit you the same way it hit me, if you believe that the people who show up without being asked are worth paying attention to, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one waiting, and I don't want you to miss them. Drop a comment below telling me which part of Rhea's story stayed with you the most. I read every single one. See you in the next story.